Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. I'm really excited to take you on an exciting journey back in time. Today we're going to dive into the fascinating world of the Vikings. These were not just fierce warriors, but incredible explorers, traders, and craftsmen. The Vikings have left such a strong mark on history, and today we'll discover who they were, where they came from, and why they're still so famous. The Vikings came from the cold northern lands of Scandinavia, which today we know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Imagine living in such a harsh environment, surrounded by mountains, forests, and icy seas. Life in these regions wasn't easy. But despite these challenges, the Vikings did something extraordinary. They didn't just stay in their villages, they looked beyond their homes. They set out on adventures, explored new lands, and even conquered vast areas of Europe. But before we talk about their raids and battles, it's important to understand that the Vikings weren't only warriors. They were farmers, fishermen, and traders. Most Vikings spent their days working hard on their land, growing crops, raising animals, and fishing to survive in such a tough climate. They lived in small villages where families depended on each other for survival. What really made the Vikings stand out, though, was their amazing ships. The Vikings were incredible sailors. They built longboats, which were fast, strong, and perfect for travel over long distances. These boats allowed them to travel across the open seas, explore new lands, and even raid faraway places. Imagine sailing across the ocean with nothing but the stars to guide you. That was the Viking way. But the Vikings didn't just raid and conquer, they were also explorers. One of the most famous Vikings, Leif Erikson, sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and reached what we now call North America, almost 500 years before Columbus. They were not just about fighting, they were curious about the world, and that curiosity took them across the seas to places most people in their time never even dreamed of. So, who exactly were these Viking explorers? How did they become such a powerful force? And what was their way of life like? In this video, we'll answer all of these questions and more. We'll take a closer look at the Vikings' incredible ships, their fierce warriors, their beliefs, and the culture they created. By the end of this video, you'll have a much better understanding of who the Vikings were, what made them so unique, and how their adventures and culture shape the world we live in today. So sit back, relax, and get ready to travel back in time to the age of the Vikings. Who were the Vikings? Let's start by answering a very important question. Who were the Vikings? The Vikings were people from the northern regions of Scandinavia. The winters were long and harsh with little sunlight. So, how did people survive in such difficult conditions? The Vikings were strong, brave, and determined. They learned to adapt to their environment and became one of the most famous cultures in history. The Viking Age lasted from the 8th century to the 11th century, which is over 1,000 years ago. Their reputation for adventure and exploration made them famous across Europe and beyond. Most Vikings lived in small villages, where the family was the central unit of society. Men worked the land, went fishing, or went to war, while women managed the home, raised children, and helped with farming. The children were often expected to learn important skills to help the family survive. Life wasn't easy, but the Vikings made it work through teamwork. The homes of Vikings were called longhouses, built using local materials like wood and animal skins. Inside, a fire was always burning to keep the family warm during the long winters. Viking homes were designed to be practical and comfortable for families to live together in tight quarters. While many Vikings worked the land, others were adventurers. They were curious about the world beyond their villages, and many decided to explore faraway lands. The Viking society was built around a strong hierarchy. At the top were the chiefs and kings, leaders who made decisions for their people. Below them were the warriors, who were trained to protect their land and fight in battles. The rest of the population included farmers, traders, and slaves, who worked to support the economy and society. The Vikings were also deeply connected to their religion. They believed in powerful gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, and they thought that dying in battle would bring them to Valhalla, a paradise where they could feast with the gods. Their culture was rich, and they left behind a legacy that still affects our world today. Vocabulary, hierarchy, a system in which people or things are ranked one above the other. Adapt, to change something in order to fit a new situation. Practical, useful, and sensible. Adventurers, people who seek out new experiences or travels. The Viking ships. Now that we know a bit about who the Vikings were, let's talk about one of the most important aspects of their culture, their ships. The Viking ships were absolutely essential for everything they did, from raids and battles to exploration and trade. Their ships were designed to make them fast, strong, and efficient on the water. The most famous Viking ship is the longship. These ships were long, narrow, and built for speed. A longship could sail in both deep seas and shallow rivers. This was very important because the Vikings would often sail up rivers to attack towns and villages that were far from the coast. The shallow draft of the ships allowed them to get close to land without getting stuck, which made them incredibly fast and dangerous. When the Vikings attacked, they came without warning, sailing in silently and striking quickly before their enemies had a chance to react. Viking ships were not just fast, they were also very strong. The frame of a Viking ship was made of oak wood, which is very strong and durable. The Vikings were expert shipbuilders, and their ships were made to handle rough waters. They used iron nails to hold the planks of wood together, and these ships were built to last for many years, even in the toughest conditions. One of the most interesting features of Viking ships was the dragon heads that were often placed on the front of the ships. These dragon heads were not just decorative, they were meant to scare the enemies. The Vikings believed that the dragon was a powerful symbol, representing strength and protection. It's also thought that these dragon heads might have helped to intimidate people, making them believe that the Vikings were fierce and unstoppable warriors. The Viking longships had large sails made of wool. The sail was rectangular, which allowed the Vikings to catch the wind and sail across the open sea. They also used oars, which allowed them to row when there was no wind. This combination of sailing and rowing made the ships very versatile. The Vikings could travel quickly when the wind was strong, but they could also row their ships when the wind wasn't favorable. This gave them an advantage, especially when they needed to make a fast escape or change direction quickly. But Viking ships weren't just used for attacking, they were also used for trade. The Vikings were not only warriors, they were also traders. They used their ships to travel to other parts of Europe, the Middle East, and even North America. They traded goods like furs, amber, iron, and silver, and they brought back spices, silks, and wine. This made the Vikings not just feared warriors, but also important players in the economy of the time. Now, let's talk a bit about the construction of these ships. The process of building a Viking ship was a huge job. It could take several months to build just one ship, and the shipbuilders were very skilled. First, they would cut down large oak trees and use the wood to create the ship's frame. Then they would carefully shape the pieces of wood to fit together, using iron nails to hold the pieces together. The ships were made to be lightweight so that they could move quickly, but they also needed to be strong enough to withstand the rough seas and battles. The craftsmanship that went into building a Viking ship was incredible, and it's no wonder they became the model for many ships that came after them. In addition to longships, the Vikings also had knars, which were cargo ships used for trade and transporting goods. These ships were broader and had a larger cargo hold than longships, making them better suited for carrying goods across long distances. While the longships were fast and used for raids, the Nars were slower but more stable and could carry more goods, making them important for the Viking economy. Viking ships were truly remarkable in many ways. They were fast, durable, and incredibly versatile. They played a major role in the success of the Viking raids, explorations, and trades. Without their ships, the Vikings wouldn't have been able to expand their influence across such vast areas. So, next time you think about the Vikings, remember that their ships were not just tools for war, but powerful instruments that helped them explore the world, build their economy, and become one of the most successful civilizations in history. Vocabulary: versatile, able to adapt or be used for many different purposes. Frame: the basic structure of something. Durable: able to last a long time without breaking or getting damaged. Intimidate: to make someone feel afraid or scared. Craftsmanship: the skill and quality involved in making something. Cargo: goods that are transported by ship, plane, or vehicle. Viking raids and warriors. Now let's dive into one of the most exciting and famous aspects of Viking life: the raids and warriors. When we think of the Vikings, many of us imagine fierce battles and savage raids, and it's true. The Vikings were feared throughout Europe for their ability to strike suddenly and attack without warning. So why did the Vikings start raiding? What made them so powerful and successful in battle? Let's take a closer look. The Vikings didn't just raid because they were violent or savage. They raided because they were looking for resources. Scandinavia was a land with harsh winters and limited resources. The Viking society relied on trade, farming, and fishing, but they also needed other things, like gold, silver, and land. The Vikings turned to raiding as a way to acquire wealth and new territory. The Viking raids began around the 8th century. The first known Viking raid took place in the year 793 when the Vikings attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, an island off the coast of England. This was the beginning of what would become a series of attacks on towns, monasteries, and cities all over Europe. The Vikings would strike quickly, raid the local population for treasure, and then disappear just as fast, often before the defenders could react. Viking raiders were incredibly efficient. They used their longships to travel up rivers, through shallow waters, and across seas. This gave them the ability to strike targets far inland, catching their victims off guard. They would attack coastal towns in the early hours of the morning before anyone could be prepared and quickly loot everything they could carry. Viking raiders were also very skilled in battle. They used axes, swords, and spears in combat. The Viking axe was particularly feared. It was a heavy, sharp weapon that could easily cut through shields and armor. The Vikings were also known for their shield walls, where they would stand close together, each holding their shield up to protect themselves and their fellow warriors. This made them almost impossible to break through. The Vikings weren't just fighters, they were also strategists. They often attacked villages during times of weakness, such as when there was a storm or a time of low food supply. They would strike quickly and retreat to their ships, taking whatever they could and leaving before anyone could respond. This tactic of sudden attacks became known as hit-and-run warfare. However, Viking raids weren't always about destruction. The Vikings also raided to capture people. Many of the people they captured were taken back to the Viking homeland and sold as slaves. In some cases, the Vikings would bring captured people back and force them to work on farms or in the households of Viking families. Slavery was common in Viking society, and it was an important part of the economy. While the Vikings were feared warriors, they weren't always attacking. Many times, they also traded with other cultures, including the Byzantine Empire, the Arabs, and the Franks. Through their raids and trading routes, the Vikings had access to goods from all over Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Now let's talk about the Viking warriors themselves. What made them so strong and fearless in battle? The Vikings had a unique warrior culture. From a young age, boys were trained to be warriors. They learned how to fight with swords, spears, and axes. They also learned how to use shields to protect themselves and their comrades in battle. But it wasn't just physical training that made the Vikings such formidable warriors. It was also their beliefs and religion. The Viking warriors also had a strong sense of brotherhood. They fought together in tight-knit groups, and their loyalty to one another was crucial in battle. Viking warriors were known to be brutal and relentless on the battlefield, but they were also honorable. They respected their leaders and followed their orders without hesitation. But Viking warriors weren't only focused on war, they were also storytellers. The Vikings had a rich oral tradition, and their sagas told the stories of their ancestors, heroes, and gods. These stories were passed down from generation to generation, keeping their history and culture alive. These sagas often told of the bravery and courage of Viking warriors, inspiring future generations to follow in their footsteps. Well, the Vikings were known for their raids. They weren't just fighting all the time, they also had families and communities. They built farms, settlements, and even towns in places like Iceland and Greenland. These places became important centers of Viking culture, and the Vikings developed a civilization that was much more than just war and fighting. So, while the Vikings were feared for their raids and warriors, they also had a rich and complex culture. Their explorations, their trade, and their warrior society shaped much of the world we know today. Vocabulary: efficient, able to do something quickly and without wasting time or resources. Loot, to steal things, especially during a time of war. Strategist, a person who plans military operations or maneuvers. Brotherhood, the relationship between people who share common interests or experiences. Saga, a long story, often about heroic deeds, brutal, cruel, or violent. Viking exploration. Now that we've talked about Viking raids and warriors, let's shift focus to another fascinating aspect of their culture: their exploration. The Vikings were not only fierce warriors, they were also some of the best explorers of their time. They sailed across vast oceans, discovered new lands, and established settlements in places far beyond their homeland in Scandinavia. One of the most famous Viking explorers was Leif Erikson. He is believed to have been the first European to set foot in North America, nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus. Around the year 1000, Leif sailed west from Greenland, following the path of his father, Eric the Red, who had already established a colony in Greenland. Leif and his crew landed on the coast of what is now Canada, specifically in an area called Vinland. The exact location of Vinland is still debated by historians, but many believe it was somewhere along the coast of Newfoundland. Leif Erikson's journey was significant because it marked the first known European presence in North America. While the Vikings did not establish permanent colonies in North America, their voyages to the New World showed their incredible courage and their desire to explore. They did not fear the unknown and were willing to take risks to discover new lands. But Leif was not the only Viking explorer. Vikings were active all over the Northern Hemisphere, from the shores of Iceland to the distant lands of Russia and the Mediterranean. They explored places like Iceland and Greenland, where they established settlements, and they ventured into areas like the Baltic Sea, where they traded with other cultures. The Vikings were also known for their travels to the Mediterranean. They sailed down the Volga River in Russia, crossed the Black Sea, and even made their way to the Byzantine Empire and the Middle East. They traded with the Arabs, the Byzantines, and the Franks, exchanging goods like furs, amber, and silver for spices, silks, and wine. This trading network connected the Vikings with cultures all across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Let's take a closer look at some of these incredible voyages. The Vikings were amazing navigators, and they used the stars, the sun, and the position of the North Star to help guide them across the open ocean. They were also very skilled at reading the weather, and they could tell where land was by the color of the water and the type of seaweed floating by. In fact, Viking explorers were known to be so skilled at navigation that they could travel long distances without modern maps or compasses. They relied on their experience, intuition, and a deep understanding of the natural world. In addition to their voyages westward to North America, the Vikings also traveled to the east, through Russia and the Caspian Sea. They established trade routes along the Volga River, and they became known as the Rus, a name that would later inspire the name of Russia. These trade routes helped the Vikings establish a network of connections that stretched across much of Europe and into the Middle East. The Vikings also made their way to the British Isles, and their presence in places like England, Ireland, and Scotland had a huge impact on the history of these regions. They raided towns and monasteries, but also settled in these areas, establishing communities and influencing the culture and language. The Danelaw, for example, was a region of England that was ruled by the Vikings for several centuries. Viking influence can still be seen in the language, place names, and even DNA of modern British people. One of the most important Viking settlements was in Iceland. In the 9th century, the Vikings established a colony there, and it became an important center of Viking culture. Iceland was a land of volcanoes, geysers, and hot springs, and the Vikings used these natural resources to help them thrive. The settlers in Iceland were also responsible for preserving many of the sagas. Iceland remains a strong symbol of Viking culture and heritage to this day. In Greenland, another Viking settlement was founded by Eric the Red in the late 10th century. Greenland was a much harsher land than Iceland, but the Vikings managed to establish settlements along the coastline. They raised cattle, hunted, and fished to survive, but eventually, the settlements in Greenland began to decline due to climate change and lack of resources. The Vikings had a hard time adapting to the colder temperatures, and by the 15th century, the Greenland settlements were abandoned. Despite these challenges, the Vikings' spirit of exploration remained strong. Their ability to navigate vast distances, their willingness to take risks, and their curiosity about the world set them apart from many other cultures of their time. The Vikings were truly among the first to chart and explore the unknown world. So what's the legacy of Viking exploration? The Vikings helped to shape the world's understanding of geography, and their voyages laid the groundwork for future explorers like Columbus and Magellan. Their adventurous spirit and desire to seek out new lands and cultures helped to connect distant regions and create a more interconnected world. Vocabulary. Navigator, a person who is skilled at planning and directing the course of a ship or journey. Courage, the ability to face fear or danger with confidence. Compasses, a tool used for finding directions. Network, a system of connections or links between people or things. Curiosity, a strong desire to learn or know something. Legacy, something handed down from the past, often a lasting impact. Viking religion and beliefs. Now let's explore one of the most fascinating aspects of Viking culture, their religion and beliefs. The Vikings had a rich mythology and a deep connection to their gods, goddesses, and spiritual practices. Their belief system was shaped by their surroundings, their experiences, and their desire to understand the world around them. At the heart of Viking religion were the gods. The Vikings believed in many powerful gods, each of whom controlled different aspects of the world. The most important of these gods was Odin, the All-Father, who was considered the god of war, wisdom, and poetry. He was a mysterious figure who gave up one of his eyes in exchange for knowledge and wisdom. Odin was known for his powerful presence and his ability to shape the fate of men. He was a god who often went on quests to gain deeper knowledge, and he was revered as the ruler of Valhalla, the great hall where warriors who died in battle would go after their death. Then there was Thor, the god of thunder. Thor was one of the most beloved gods in Viking society. He was known for his strength and bravery, and he wielded a mighty hammer called Mjolnir, which could summon lightning and defeat giants. Thor was a protector of both gods and humans, and his role in the Viking pantheon made him a symbol of protection and power. Many Viking warriors would pray to Thor before going into battle, hoping that his strength would be with them. Another important deity was Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. She was also associated with war and death, as she was said to receive half of the slain warriors in battle and take them to her hall, Folkvange. Freya was a fierce and powerful figure, but she also represented the softer aspects of life, such as love and home. She was often portrayed as a beautiful and alluring woman, and many Vikings believed she could bring prosperity and happiness into their lives. The Vikings also had a deep belief in the Norse cosmos, which was made up of 9 worlds. These worlds were connected by a giant tree called Yggdrasil, the World Tree. Yggdrasil was an immense tree that reached into every part of the universe, connecting all the realms of existence, from the peaceful land of the gods, Asgard, to the dark and cold Niflheim. The tree was a symbol of life, growth, and the interconnectedness of all things. It was believed that everything in the world was linked to this sacred tree, and it stood as a central pillar in the Viking worldview. The Vikings believed in fate and the idea that their lives were predestined by the gods. They had a concept called the Norns, who were 3 women responsible for controlling the fate of all beings. The Norns would decide when a person would live and when they would die. It was believed that no one could escape their fate, and this understanding of destiny influenced how Vikings lived their lives. They embraced the idea that death was not to be feared, but rather it was a natural part of life. This is why Viking warriors were so fearless in battle. They believed that they were destined to die in the way that the gods had planned. One of the most important aspects of Viking religion was their rituals and sacrifices. The Vikings believed that in order to honor the gods, they had to offer sacrifices. These sacrifices were typically animals, like horses, but sometimes even humans were sacrificed, especially during times of great need, like before going into battle or during important religious festivals. Sacrificial rituals were held at sacred places, such as groves or temples, and the Vikings would often hold feasts and celebrations to honor the gods. These rituals were meant to ensure that the gods were pleased and would provide the Vikings with protection, victory, and prosperity. The Viking religion also had a strong connection to the land and nature. The Vikings believed that the world was alive with spirits and that every tree, river, and mountain had its own spirit. They would often make offerings to these spirits, asking for good harvests, protection during travels, and success in their ventures. The Vikings' belief in nature and the spirit world was deeply tied to their daily lives and helped to shape their interactions with the environment around them. As time went on, the Viking religion began to change, especially with the arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia around the 10th century. Over time, many Vikings adopted Christian beliefs, but many of the old traditions and stories continued to live on in the sagas and folklore passed down through generations. Even today, many aspects of Viking religion and mythology continue to influence Scandinavian culture, from names and customs to national symbols and holidays. In summary, Viking religion was a complex and rich belief system that revolved around powerful gods, nature, fate, and the afterlife. The Vikings were deeply connected to their gods, and their religion played a central role in their daily lives. The gods gave them strength in battle, guidance in life, and hope for a better future. Even as their world changed, the Vikings' belief in their gods and the spirit world continued to shape their society for generations to come. Vocabulary: cosmos, the universe considered as a whole; fate, the development of events beyond a person's control; Norns, the three goddesses who control destiny in Norse mythology; ritual, a religious or solemn ceremony consisting of a series of actions; sacrifice, an act of offering something valuable to a god; folklore, traditional beliefs, customs, and stories passed through generations. The end of the Viking Age. While the Viking Age is often remembered for its raids, explorations, and warriors, it didn't last forever. By the 11th century, the Viking Age began to wind down, and several factors contributed to the end of this iconic period in history. So, what happened to the Vikings? Why did their powerful raids and settlements stop? One of the biggest reasons for the end of the Viking Age was the growing strength and unity of the European kingdoms. For centuries, the Vikings had been able to raid and attack with relative impunity. Their longships allowed them to strike quickly and disappear before the defenders could respond. But over time, the European kingdoms became more organized and better defended. One of the turning points came with the Christianization of Scandinavia. Christianity had already begun to spread across Europe, and by the 10th and 11th centuries, many Vikings had started to convert to Christianity. This process was not always peaceful, and there were many conflicts between the old Norse beliefs and the new Christian faith. However, as more Vikings embraced Christianity, they began to lose their connection to the old gods and the warrior culture that had once defined their identity. The conversion to Christianity also meant the end of many Viking religious practices. The Vikings no longer performed their ancient sacrifices to the gods, and the traditional pagan rituals faded away. With the spread of Christianity, the Viking worldview began to shift, and their old ways of life were gradually replaced by a new religious and cultural order. Another factor that led to the end of the Viking Age was the rise of powerful kings and centralized monarchies. In England, for example, the Anglo-Saxon king Alfred the Great had successfully repelled Viking raids in the 9th century, and by the 11th century, England had become more united and less vulnerable to Viking attacks. Other European kingdoms, like France and the Holy Roman Empire, also became stronger and more stable, which made it harder for Viking raiders to succeed. In Scandinavia, powerful Viking leaders began to establish kingdoms and create more unified states. By the end of the Viking Age, places like Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had more centralized governments, which meant less freedom for Viking warriors to raid on their own. The old Viking system of tribal leadership and independent chieftains gradually gave way to larger, more formalized kingdoms, reducing the need for the Viking way of life. One significant event that marked the end of the Viking Age was the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. This battle occurred when the Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, attempted to invade England. He was defeated by the Anglo-Saxon king, Harold Godwinson, in a brutal battle. The defeat of Harald Hardrada is often seen as the last major Viking invasion of England. This battle, combined with the Norman conquest of England later in 1066, marked the end of the Viking raids and the start of a new era in European history. In addition to the changing political landscape, another factor contributing to the decline of the Vikings was the climate. The period known as the medieval warm period, which allowed the Vikings to thrive in places like Greenland, began to shift. As the climate grew colder during the Little Ice Age around the 14th century, Viking settlements in places like Greenland struggled to survive. The harsh winters and short growing seasons made farming difficult, and the Vikings were unable to adapt to these changes. The Viking Age also came to an end as the Vikings began to settle down and assimilate into the cultures they had once raided. Many Vikings, who had initially come to places like England and France as invaders, eventually settled and became part of the local population. Over time, they adopted the languages, customs, and religions of the people they had conquered. For example, in Normandy, in northern France, the Viking descendants, known as the Normans, eventually became powerful rulers and played a key role in European history, including the Norman conquest of England in 1066. As the Vikings integrated into these new societies, their distinct Viking culture began to fade. They no longer raided or explored the same way, and their warrior identity became less central to their daily lives. The end of the Viking Age marked the beginning of a new chapter in European history, as the world became more centralized, Christianized, and politically stable. In conclusion, the Viking Age came to an end due to a combination of factors: the rise of powerful kingdoms, the spread of Christianity, changing climates, and the evolution of Viking society from raiders to settlers. While the era of Viking raids and exploration may have ended, the legacy of the Vikings continues to influence modern cultures in Scandinavia and beyond. Their adventurous spirit, warrior mentality, and their impact on language, place names, and history remain a vital part of the world we know today. Vocabulary: impunity, freedom from punishment or harm; pagan, relating to the religious beliefs of ancient cultures before Christianity; monarchies, systems of government where a king or queen rules; assimilate, to adopt the customs and culture of another group; Normans, people from the region of Normandy in northern France, descended from Vikings; centralized, controlled by a single authority or government. Legacy of the Vikings. The Vikings have left an incredible legacy that still influences us today. From place names to the stories they've inspired, their presence is deeply rooted in modern culture. Many cities in England, France, and Scandinavia carry Viking names, and elements of their culture still live on in these places. Their Viking spirit is alive in the architecture, festivals, and traditions of countries they once raided or settled in. For instance, the Viking Ship Museum in Norway continues to attract visitors celebrating their shipbuilding and seafaring skills. The Vikings also significantly impacted the English language. Modern English is full of words that trace their origins back to Old Norse. This includes common terms like sky, egg, and leg, as well as legal terms such as husband and law. When the Vikings settled in England and interacted with the Anglo-Saxons, their language began to mix, influencing Old English in ways that are still felt today. But the legacy of the Vikings goes beyond just vocabulary. The way they communicated was practical and direct, which is a feature that modern English has inherited. If you want to improve your English, studying history through the lens of fascinating stories, like the Vikings' adventures, can make learning much more enjoyable and meaningful. The rich history of the Vikings allows us to learn new vocabulary, understand the context behind these words, and see how language has evolved over time. Learning English through stories of people like the Vikings also helps you understand how different cultures shaped our modern world. Stories are powerful tools that make language come alive, especially when they connect us with the past. Whether it's history, mythology, or even legends passed down through generations, exploring these topics in English helps you discover new vocabulary and improve your comprehension. If you enjoyed this journey through the Viking Age, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more exciting content on history and language. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to sharing more fascinating stories with you soon. Keep learning and feel free to share this video with friends who enjoy history and the English language.